All right. Little bit more on some absolute monarchs here. So we're going to wrap up what we started with Louis the 14th. So we're just going to keep on trucking with Louis the 14th here. So in the last video, we talked about Versailles and how Louis used Versailles to keep the most important nobles from rebelling against him. So we're going to look at a few other things that Louis the 14th does during his reign. The first of these other things that we're going to mention is that Louis revokes the Edict of Nantes, which, if you remember, guaranteed religious tolerance. So he revokes the Edict of Nantes and he replaces it with the Edict of, make sure I spell this correctly, Fontainebleau. And he does this in 1685. So this takes away, it revokes the religious protections for the Huguenots. So remember, Richelieu kept the religious protections for the Huguenots and took away their political rights. Louis is going to take that a step further and take away their religious protections. Now, the point of this was to further kind of solidify Louis's Catholic control over France. And he does that. That really happens. It causes about 200,000 Huguenots to leave France. So Louis gets the result he wants. He gets rid of all of these people who aren't following his Catholic religion. The problem, though, is that these 200,000 Huguenots are going to end up in the Netherlands and in England and, as we already kind of know, these are France's enemies. We also know that these Huguenots are typically rich, well-educated people. And so while Louis has managed to kind of shore up Catholic unity in France, the people that are fleeing France are going to France's enemies, the Netherlands and England, and these people are typically rich and well-educated. Those are the kinds of people you want in your country. And as France starts picking fights with all of their neighbors, which we're about to start talking about, these people are more than happy to lend their support to their new home against the guy that just kicked them out of their old home. So, let's now talk about the wars of Louis XIV. Another aspect of absolute monarchy is that there are lots of wars. This is a characteristic of absolute monarchy in general. So most absolute monarchs fight a lot of wars. It's tough to say what is the reason for that. It might be because they're absolute monarchs and they want to show off how big and powerful they are. Another way of thinking about it is that now that the Pope has kind of been removed as a referee, it allows for more conflicts. So it's tough to say which caused the other to happen. This is one of those classic chicken or the egg things. What came first? But as we've said, time period 2 is a period of lots of conflict, and we see a lot of conflict associated with Louis XIV. Now, most of these wars, so Louis was in charge for 72 years. So most of Louis's 72 years were in war. Like, there were a lot of wars. And most of them we're not really going to talk about, most of which are petty squabbles for little bits of land between France and the Netherlands, or France and a little Germany. We don't really need to worry about them. But most of these 72 years that Louis was in charge were in war. The last one of these wars, though, it does bear a little bit of discussion. The last war is called the War of Spanish Succession. And this war goes from 1701 to 1714. Now, the background of this war isn't really that important, but Louis's first wife was Spanish, and she died, maybe under mysterious circumstances. She might have died of natural causes. She also might have been poisoned. There was a big poisoning scandal going on at Versailles in the 1660s. So it's likely that she might have died of natural causes, but there's also this idea that she might have been poisoned. But in any event, she was Spanish, and when she died, their children were in line to be rulers of Spain. Not like directly in line, but they were in line. Through a series of, we'll call them, unfortunate events, Louis's grandson became next in line. So all the people ahead of Louis's grandson died. And so Louis's grandson, whose grandmother was this princess from Spain, was next in line to be king of Spain. No one wanted this. Because what this could do, it had the possibility to unite Spain and France under one king. And no one wanted that, especially because of Spain's colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So if this were to happen, Louis would control a big part of Europe and most of the Western Hemisphere through his grandson. And you would be dumb to believe that Louis would not be pulling the strings on his grandson, now the King of Spain. So the rest of Europe united against Spain and France. And we get, like we did at the end of the 30 Years' War, we get a negotiated settlement. So here's what ends up happening. The grandson does become King of Spain. But he renounces any claim on France. So he is the King of Spain, but he can't become King of France too. Austria is going to get some Spanish territory. Notably, what are now the Austrian Netherlands, aka Belgium. And France is going to give England a lot of North American territory. Principally Quebec. So when we get to the wars of like the American Revolution and the French Revolution, this is going to set up some of the pieces that are going to be important in those conflicts. Okay, so I think we're done talking about Louis. We will come back to Louis's legacy when we get to the French Revolution. But I think for the moment, we're done talking about Louis. Now, let's turn our attention to the east and look at Peter the Great. So Peter the Great and Louis overlap. They are in charge for some of the same time. Peter the Great is in charge for what looks like 36 years. Now, Peter has a different goal in mind than Louis. Louis's goal was to have absolute power, depower the nobility, remove any threats to his rule. Peter's main goal was different. Peter wanted to modernize Russia. He wanted to modernize Russia. And in his mind, what modernizing Russia meant was westernize it. Make it look like the countries in Western Europe. So maybe the most famous thing that Peter does is his grand embassy. So early on in his rule, Peter goes to visit other European countries incognito. So he dresses up like a regular person. The problem with that is that Peter was like instantly recognizable. And that was because of his height. He was 6'8", and everybody knew that the Russian Tsar was 6'8". And so when this giant Russian guy shows up saying that he's just like a shipbuilder or a worker or whatever he said he was, dressed in regular clothes, everybody knew he was Peter. Everybody knew he was the Tsar. And everybody just kind of played along because that's what you do when the Tsar wants you to play along. So what he does is he learns how other countries do things. Especially shipbuilding. Like, Peter actually participates in shipbuilding. He learns how to do it from people building ships. And so he's going to bring that back to Russia. And kind of later on in his rule, he is going to kind of single-handedly create Russia's navy. He understands that for a country to be powerful, it needs to have a strong navy. Just like what he saw in the Netherlands and in France and in England. He sees a strong navy, so Russia is going to go about building a navy. But a lot of the other stuff that Peter does is going to look very similar to what Louis did. Like Louis, Peter will depower the nobles and force them to westernize. One of the most famous things he did was that he forced all the nobles to shave their beards. And if they didn't, he at first forced them to shave. But later he realized that if they wanted to keep their beards, he could just tax them and let them keep their beards. But this is a show of Peter's force. He's going to build a new capital city, a new Western style capital. Capital. And he's going to call it St. Petersburg. Not after himself, but he's naming it after St. Peter. And this is their new capital. The reason he picks this place is that St. Petersburg is a warm water port for Russia's new navy. In fact, you can make a pretty good argument that all of European history revolves around Russia's desire to hold warm water ports. anytime that this comes up, I'm going to make a reference to it because Russia wants warm water ports. Everything they're going to do for like the next 150 years is a desire to have warm water ports that don't freeze over in the winter. This is maybe Russia's number one foreign policy goal. And from this point forward, you can tell a pretty convincing story of European history by looking at that. So he builds this new Western style capital. He's going to build a fancy Baroque palace for himself called Peterhof. This one I think is named after him. Having been to both Peterhof and Versailles, they look very similar, and they both have this aura of awesomeness. Like, you do really feel small in both of these places. He's going to kind of centralize religious worship and take control of the Orthodox Church. So he's going to appoint his own bishops, much like Louis does. And we want to keep a tally of all these things that he's doing. He's also going to go to war. A lot. The longest conflict, the biggest conflict that Peter gets involved in is the Great Northern War. Which was 1700 to 1725, or 1721. Sorry, 1721. The details of this really aren't important, but the main players here are Russia and Sweden. And the result of this war is that Russia wins and Sweden kind of becomes a minor power after this. We don't really talk too much about Sweden after the Great Northern War. So this was kind of a fight between which one of these countries is going to become the Great Northern Power. Is it going to be Russia, which was growing in power, or Sweden, which was already kind of the main Northern European power, like we saw them get involved in the 30 Years' War under Gustavus Adolphus, and they were kind of a dominant figure in Northern Europe. This is where we see the shift. Russia kind of replaces Sweden as the main Northern European power. This is also where we see Russia turn its attention to Poland. And we mentioned when we talked about limited monarchies that Poland is going to be very slow to respond to this stuff, and Russia is going to kind of eat up Poland to the point where it becomes a Russian protectorate. It becomes part of Russia. So we're not going to spend as much time on Peter as we did Louis, but he's doing pretty much the same stuff that Louis was doing. So he's kind of following the same playbook with a different overall goal to westernize Russia, but he's doing pretty much the same stuff that Louis is doing. And so let's go back to this question that should have been at the back of your mind as we've talked about Louis and Peter. How absolute is the power of an absolute monarch? How absolute is the power of an absolute monarch? So, in my mind, it kind of comes down to the question of theoretical power versus real power. Like, theoretically, an absolute monarch does have all the power. Like, the way it's set up, yes, an absolute monarch does have all the power. There are no checks. There are no limits. And especially after Louis and Peter, they've done everything they can to remove whatever checks and limits there may have been. But the larger question is, how does that translate? Does that mean they actually have no checks or limits? And so there are a number of things that we can point to that do actually limit the power of an absolute monarch. So, for one thing, distance and lack of information are constraints. Like, your rule may be law, but it takes a while for all of those laws to get out to everybody to know what you're talking about. And you also have a lack of information about what's going on out there. It takes time for all of that information to get to you. So, theoretically, yes, there are no checks. But the distance and the time it takes for your rules to get out to the people and for you to see the effects of those rules, that's a limitation. Here's another thing that might constrain an absolute monarch: tradition. Especially for somebody like Peter, who is rapidly changing how everything in Russia looked. People don't like change. And they're going to resist things they can resist. So if you're not constantly reinforcing these things, people are going to resist. Like, if no one is telling people in Russia every day to shave, they're not going to shave if they don't want to. And finally, here's another constraint on an absolute monarch, and that's just corruption and incompetence. Like, if you've got a corrupt government official that can be paid to look the other way while you continue to break the king's rules, well, all of the theoretical power a king has isn't going to stop that. If you've got dumb people trying to enforce your rules, that's, again, that's going to keep your rules from being enforced. Maybe they don't understand them. So all of these things limit the power of an absolute monarch. Because what it looks like all of these things that actually limit the power of an absolute monarch, all of these things make the monarch look disingenuous. Like, he's saying one thing, but different results are happening. Like, he's saying we're all united, we're all doing this. I'm saying we're doing it, and we're doing it. But the people see with their own eyes that not every time the king says we're doing something, it happens. He claims one thing, and the result is sometimes different than that. And the more that happens, the more there are differences between the king's words and the actions or results of the government, the more likely there are to be rebellions and even revolutions. So that is a question we will come back to after we finish looking at the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, because even though an absolute monarch claims to have absolute power, reality is going to cause that to be not true. And the people are going to realize it. And so the other side of these revolutions we're going to start looking at in our next series of videos, because people are going to now be trained to look for truth, whether that's scientific truth or philosophical truth. And this is an example of where people are going to see things that aren't true. They're going to see the king tell us something, but our own eyes are telling us something else. And that's a cause for problems. And we will turn to those problems later. But before we do that, we have to look at the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment to see how people are now going to be looking at the world differently. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.